Indeed, good evening. My name is Jordi McKenzie. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. It's my immense pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Joel Waldfogel, who is giving today's keynote lecture entitled Digitization and the Creation and Consumer Discovery of Cultural Products. Professor Waldfogel is the Frederick R. Kaplan Chair in Applied Economics in the Carson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, where he also serves as the Associate Dean of MBA and MS programs. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, he was employed in the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, and prior to this in the Economics Department at Yale University. Since 1993, he's also had continuous appointments in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Waldfogel is recognized as leading international authority in the economics of media and cultural industries, with a continuing record of publications, top journals in economics. He's published 3 books, 8 edited book volumes, 11 book chapters, and more than 80 peer-reviewed journal articles. Throughout his career, he's consistently published in the most respected journals of the discipline, including American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal, Rand Journal of Economics, and of course, Journal of Cultural Economics. On the authoritative REPEC author ranking list, he is ranked number 1 in the field of cultural economics and in the top 5% of all authors across the entire field of economics, both in terms of publications and in the last 10 years, both in terms of publications and the last 10 years and of all time. According to Google Scholar, his research has been cited more than 10,000 times. His work has also been cited in leading print and online media, including The Economist, Time Magazine, Forbes Magazine, New York Times, The Washington Post, Financial Times, The Boston Globe, and The Wall Street Journal, among others. Since 2004, Professor Waldfogel has served as an Associate Editor of Information Economics and Policy, and has previously been a member of editorial boards of the International Review of Law and Economics and the BE Journal of Economics Analysis and Policy. Outside of academia, he served as consultant for the World Bank and as a committee member for the US National Academy of Sciences. Professor Waldfogel will speak for approximately 45 to 50 minutes. As with all previous keynote lectures and panels, please feel free to post questions or comments in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. In the last 10 minutes or so, I will help facilitate a discussion of these questions, and if we run out of time, we will try and get these answered after the session concludes. Joel, I'll hand it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It makes me feel, I guess, old, those large numbers of things I apparently have done. But thank you. And it's nice to be here, wherever here might be. I don't think I have to ask, can you see my slides? But I still feel that I guess you probably can. All right, fine. So I want to talk about how digitization has affected the cultural industries. And really, the first act for digitization was piracy. Now, and I should also just note as I get into this, this is a keynote-y type talk, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of things, but I'll also give you references to if you want to sort of more deeply. Nope, we cannot see your slides. Is that right? Oh, goodness. Why would that be? So let me press a button. How about now? The answer is yes, we're good now. Okay, the pandemic. Okay, yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about a lot of things, and so I'll give you references if you want to go deeper. Of course, I'm happy to answer questions a bit later. Anyways, as we think about digitization, really for me, Act 1 of digitization in the cultural industries is the arrival of Napster and piracy. And that immediately brings to mind this picture of, this is US shipments, but world data look pretty much the same, that revenue is rising in the music industry until about 1999, and then it just begins to plummet. That's the arrival of digitization to the cultural industries, with music as the canary in the coal mine, as it were. There was a research kerfuffle about this, and I was involved. Was piracy the culprit? The short answer is yes. But I mean, actually, to be fair, it's a relatively hard empirical question to answer, and so that's why it was a kerfuffle. But I think in their papers, that on various sides of this issue, but I think at the end of the day, the longer answer also is yes, that the ability for people to get stuff without paying for it undermined their tendency to pay for it, and so revenue fell by more than half in this industry, which really raised alarms about whether there would be continued production of cultural materials, not just in music, but in other places where digitization and piracy would be possible. So on its own, the beginning of digitization, piracy raised calls for stronger IP protection, more enforcement, and all the rest. So I don't want to talk a lot about piracy today, so I'll skip quickly to Act 2. Act 2 is that, well, on the one hand, digitization made it possible to steal stuff and therefore made it harder to generate revenue. It also made it cheaper to produce stuff. Costs fell, reduced the cost of production, distribution, promotion, which made it easier in principle to bring things to market without the investments needed or the permissions from the traditional intermediaries. Again, in principle, that was a possibility. And indeed, despite piracy, kind of a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, which was there was an explosion of creative output in all the industries that I tend to think about, in music, in movies, in television, in books, in photography, in just a host of industries. The number of new products created per year really rose. Now, that by itself doesn't really mean we're out of the woods. And so worrywarts were still convinced, oh, there's got to be some bad news out there somewhere. And indeed, there were concerns about amateurs or barbarians at the gate. And to be fair, I think there's some reason to be sympathetic to these concerns, at least a priori, because after all, traditionally, these intermediaries, the movie studios, the music record labels, the book publishers, they really have engaged in what you might call adult supervision to help curate and bring good things to market. And so, it's sort of funny to look at some of these quotes. One of my favorite quotes, a person critical of the outpouring of amateur production, is the description of a self-publishing site as an open slush pile. And of course, there's some truth to that. All right, though, the concern, serious concern, but maybe expressed in a lighthearted way, is that is a cultural stone age on the horizon. Even if we have plenty of stuff, maybe it's all bad. So, that kind of calls out for us to think about ways to evaluate whether digitization was, making a mess of things or helping us in some ways. And so let's first think a little bit about digitization and copyright. So I think it's fair to say, at least traditionally and maybe still, that cultural products are both expensive and risky. In the US, Hollywood's one of our proudest industries. It costs over $100 million to make and market a big movie, more for some of the biggest ones. So on average, for the big theatrical releases, a number like 100 million is not unrealistic. And the recording industry is also quite investment intensive. They spend a lot. And I think it's also important to note that they're very risky. Most products fail. And so without some financing, both to cover the costs of the failures and the successes, it might be hard to finance creativity. So again, I think we should take these kinds of arguments seriously. Copyright grants creators monopoly rights in order to provide incentives or so that they can actually finance, what they're creating. We all know monopoly is bad, but we accept that. We accept the bad with the good in exchange for the idea that we'd have incentives for continued creation, right? So digitization, what did it do? Well, it arguably reduced effective protection, and so that might undermine creative incentives. And many would believed and believe still we need stronger enforcement. Well, but we sort of have a horse race going on here, right? We have revenue falling, we have costs falling. It's not frankly clear what's going to happen. And so it's worth thinking about how would we even know whether copyright is working? And I think there's a standard question people began asking 15 years ago that's an interesting question, sort of, but kind of the wrong question, which is what's happening to the revenue of incumbent firms? Well, that would be the right question to ask if costs hadn't changed, because if revenue fell and costs stayed the same, we couldn't finance any new production. But, if cost reduction occurs, then maybe lower revenue is sufficient to even generate efficient levels or sufficient levels of creativity. So there's really kind of a horse race. And in my view, the last, for some parts of the last 10 or 15 years, I've been thinking about this better question of what's happened to the quantity and quality of cultural products under digitization. Now, quality is a very loaded word. And so let me just at the outset say by quality, I really mean stuff that people like, as opposed to aesthetic quality, although I have some things to say about aesthetic quality too. As an economist, though, that's mostly about my pay grade. But the road to Damascus here, my conversion, I guess, occurred when I thought, well, this is a better question rather than what happened to revenue. What happened to revenue is interesting, but it's not sufficient. All right, now I'd like to talk for a few slides about how might it be that digitization actually improves the quality of products. And so here, I think a very important idea is that these are super unpredictable industries. New product, the success of new products is very, very difficult to predict at the time of release. In fact, there's this wonderful quote from William Goldman, who wrote Adventures in the Screen Trade, as well as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and some other great classics. But he says, nobody knows anything. That was his description of the extent to which Hollywood's able to predict which movies will succeed. Well, it turns out nobody knows anything is a pretty good description of all cultural products at the time of release, and frankly, many other products outside the cultural sphere as well. So in that kind of a world, it's going to turn out, in my view, that that something that changes the number of products that get released could have a very big effect on the experienced quality of products. So let me explain that idea. Suppose the way the world works, from the stylized economist view of the world, investors, these are the gatekeeping intermediaries, they make a guess about the marketability of a proposed work. You know, you pitch your movie or your book or your song, your album to an intermediary, and they make a guess, and they greenlight it if the expected revenue exceeds the cost. Now, if the number of works rises, and I've already told you it does, so there's no spoiler alert really needed, then the question is, what happens to the volume of good work available to consumers if the amount of work period rises? Now, just to get clarity about this, let's pretend for a second, even though it's totally not true, that marketability were entirely predictable. Well, then bringing more products to market would mean bringing products to market, all of which are worse than the old threshold for whether we should release them. So we'd get some more products, they'd be somewhat valuable to somebody, but they'd all be of very low, kind of modest quality. It would not be a big deal for consumers. But contrast that with the way we quite honestly think the world does work, the nobody knows anything characterization. Now, if you're going to release products with expected quality above a new lower cost threshold, you're going to get new products that are not just all worse than the old threshold, but they're going to be all over the place. If you're completely unpredictable, some of these will be great, some of them will be terrible. Yes, there will be an open slush pile, but there will also be a few right tail winners among the products that are now feasible under the lower costs made possible by digitization. So that's the idea. The release of products with less ex ante promise leads to a greater number of products with ex post success and value to consumers, and for that matter, revenue. So that's all just at this point a possibility. So what do we have to look at empirically to figure this out? How do we distinguish a digital renaissance from a cultural stone age? Well, I think three questions. One is, are there more new products? And I've already kind of given that one away. A second kind of question is, do ex ante losers end up among the ex post winners? So what I mean is, again, the products that would not have been greenlit before, but that can proceed now. We didn't expect them to do well, but to some of them surprisingly do well. So do ex ante losers end up among the ex post winners? And thirdly, are the new vintages good compared with the old vintages? That's how we would know whether we're literally in a golden age. Okay, now I also in this talk, I'll talk about these things, but I'll also talk a bit about another challenge that we all face, which is product discovery. How do consumers find products and how do products find consumers? But I'll get to that in a bit. So what I'll do is I'll make this talk about music, but actually in the book, I don't mean to be advertising it, but I'm just trying to tell you that I've sort of summarized a lot of these arguments in this book, and I talk about all these industries. But for today's purpose, I'll focus on music, partly because it was the canary in the coal mine, and partly because it's just interesting. And so I'll talk a little bit about how it worked before digitization and how digitization affected it. I do also want to mention the theme of this evidence-based approach. Well, copyright and copyright policy has really had to proceed without a ton of evidence, in part because it's hard to get relevant data. And one of the things I've tried to advocate in this work is the gathering of useful data, even if it's sometimes unusual data, to try to say something evidence-based and arguably true, as opposed to just sort of the arguments of interested parties, which are sometimes rather self-interested and biased. Okay, anyways, so let's talk about the music industry. The olden days. So how does this industry work kind of before digitization? Lots of wannabes. A lot of folks are eager to get recorded and released and so forth. It's a tough slog historically to convince the gatekeepers, who have traditionally been record labels, to invest. Even some of our most iconic, famous acts really had a lot of trouble. The Beatles had a lot of trouble. It took them years to kind of to break through and even get signed. There are similar great stories about Bruce Springsteen. So there are big investments required historically and nurture. So this Bruce Springsteen, another great U.S. export along with software and movies. The first two albums weren't that successful, but Clive Davis invested in a bunch of more studio time for the third album. Apparently, months and months just to record the song "Born to Run." And of course the rest is history. So I mean, the notion that we needed curation and investment there are plenty of anecdotes and plenty of stories to support that that was in fact important. And even getting released wasn't enough. You had to get on radio, and that was tough because of either literal payola or effective payola. And then getting into stores was expensive and tough because, after all, many products have to be there for the demand that might arrive for some of them. So the whole process was expensive and cumbersome. And in some sense, you know, odds were stacked against anybody succeeding. You know, notwithstanding that, and you probably can't really see this slide, but it's fun when you put together, you know, material like this. You can find, well, what are some artists who are both commercially successful and critically acclaimed? And snobs can look at this and say, look, Garth Brooks, he's sold 148 million albums, but he's not on the Rolling Stone list of top anything. Whereas there are other artists who make both lists nicely. Anyways, I won't dwell on this, but it is fun to put together lists like this. So the point is, despite the challenges of even coming to market, there were some triumphs of both art and commerce in the old system. Yes, as I told you, piracy visited music. So there's that scary picture in the upper right, but costs fell. So there's a more encouraging picture in the lower right. And how did costs fall? Well, production, used to require a studio and skilled labor. Now it became feasible with pretty inexpensive equipment. The GarageBand software on your iPhone or on a Mac, a decent studio. Distribution, well, you didn't need physical distribution. For $10, you could make your song available via iTunes. That's already economic history, but still, that's a lot cheaper than having to convince stores to carry it and pressing it on CDs and all the rest. And consequently, the number of new products did explode. So, as for the specific kind of empirical questions one needs to ask to say, is it Renaissance or Stone Age? First of all, are there lucky ex-ante losers? That is, do the artists with less ex-ante promise, who would not even have made it through in the prior to digitization, now achieve sales success? Now, answering that question requires us to come up with some notion of what an ex-ante loser is in music. And so here, I think the structure of the industry gives us some suggestions. We have major labels and indie labels. The majors sign these artists expected to be pretty successful. The majors engage in high cost investment, promotion, and all the rest. The indies had traditionally signed artists with more modest prospects. So pretty much by construction, the indie artists were these, and I don't mean that they're literally losers. Most of my favorite artists are indie artists, but nevertheless, artists, might have preferred to be on major labels, but if you weren't commercially expected to be commercially successful enough, you'd find your way to an indie label. One little bit of sort of evidence that there's a hierarchy of that sort is that many of your favorite indie artists, when they got the chance, did move over to major labels. That's what this table is showing you. Eventually, when money beckons the opportunity, people tend to prefer that. Anyways, though, if you buy my argument that the indie artists, the indie label artists, are the ex-ante losers, the relevant question is, do these artists with less ex-ante promise, the indie guys, end up accounting for a growing share of ex-post success, sales? And what these pictures are showing you is that, based on, for example, Billboard data in the US, that yes, the indie share of sales rose rather substantially. The indie share among the Billboard 200 rose by about a factor of 3 between 2001 and 2010. Even if you look at the highest end of the distribution, the top 25, we're going from 6 to about 18%. So yes, there's growth in the indie share of successful or commercially successful stuff. Oh, by the way, there's an homage to Tom Petty. Even the losers get lucky sometimes. Okay, now, is the second question, is the new music good compared with the old music? This is a super tough question. Most economists would not bother asking it. It's just too risky to your reputation to try. But anyways, there are a couple of ways. I think it's an important question, so I decided let's forge ahead and do it. A couple of ways one can go about it. One is to look at what critics say. And in particular, critics who have these multi-year best of lists, maybe the most famous example of which is the Rolling Stone 500 best albums of all time. If you take that list of 500 albums and put it into the years in which it was released or in which they were released, you get this picture on the left-hand side here. It shows that the pinnacle, of music was 1970, and it's sort of been downhill since then. This list was put together around 2000. Well, I found many, many such lists. By the way, this is just lists from the Rolling Stone. It's fun to reminisce if you can remember certain of these decades. I was pretty young in 1970, but these songs are kind of evergreen, so I think we know most of them. Anyways, is the new music compared to the old? So what I did is I found lots of multi-year best of lists, and I did to all of them what I did to the Rolling Stone list, and sort of spliced them together to create a little bit of an index and to get the common time effects out of all these indices. And if you do that, here's what you get. And there, I'll just release the tension there, and you can see what happens. So in the period in which revenue is plummeting, what happens to this number of very high quality works, according to the aggregation across the indices, is that it's stable. Okay, so revenue is collapsing, the number of good works is stable. Now, what can one say? On the one hand, you might say, well, it was falling and now it's not falling, so it's rising relative to falling, recalling, the comment about the one arm versus the two-handed economist. But if anything, I guess more conservatively, one could say that the constancy of this amount of good stuff is at least a big contrast to the collapse of revenue after Napster. Well, I have a second, in some sense, better way to, from some perspectives, a better way to think about the volume of valuable music being created, which is to rely on people's actual choices. So to create a measure of the quality of different vintages based on the service flow, using data on sales and airplay. So here's the idea. The idea is that if one vintage's music is better than another's, then its appeal should generate higher sales or greater airplay after accounting for how old it is for depreciation. And so it's kind of tough to get the relevant data here, but I have some. So I have data on airplay by calendar year and vintage of the original music for 5 calendar years, 04 to 08. I have data on sales from the certifications, from the certification data. Later, I got actual Nielsen data as well. So I can do the following. I can do the following. So here's the geeky slide. Define STV as the share of vintage V music in the sales or airplay during period T. So these sum to 1 during the year, but across the different vintages. For a given year T, this S thing is going to vary across vintages because of depreciation and because of variation in vintage quality, the thing in red that I care about. So if I were to regress the log of STV on age dummies to account for depreciation and vintage dummies, the vintage dummies would show me how the value of vintages, or the usefulness of vintages, or quality, if you will, evolves over time. Now, if I do that, here's what I get. Now, first of all, even before I show what happened after 2000, these are kind of interesting because they're totally independent of the critic stuff, and yet they are the same in the sense that they show 1970 as the high water mark for music. And then the quality falls. Now, what happens after 2000? Well, it rises pretty substantially by both measures, by measures based on both of these two independent sources of data, one based on airplay, one based on the sales in the certification data for US RIAA sales. So my bottom line would be, yeah, it's actually a golden age in music. It's things are as good as they've been since the mid 70s, not quite 1970 level, but since mid 70s. There's no evidence that vintage quality has declined. There's more compelling evidence that it's increased. Now, it is hard to know what might otherwise have been. Like, it could be that still piracy has taken us away from something that would have been even better. And I don't deny that that's possible, but it's not quite the same as saying the sky is falling, we don't even have what we used to have. We're better off, apparently, by these measures than we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it's quite a big contrast to sort of the big media view that piracy is killing us and we need to, hang pirates and all the rest. Okay, but we might want to hang them for other reasons, like stealing is just wrong, 10 commandments and so forth. Now, I won't in today's talk about all the other industries, but let me just maybe a few teaser facts. So I briefly showed this picture earlier. You really do see very similar patterns in the other industries. Movies, the number of new movies has just exploded. And think about that one. I mean, we used to just really make movies for theatrical distribution. Now we make movies for direct digital distribution. So there are plenty of commercially serious, but much smaller scale movies being created. Lots and lots of them. Of course, there's also the slush pile. Television has grown literally exponentially. The number of books has grown enormously, largely due to self-publishing. If you think about what's an ex-ante loser, well, a self-published book is really an ex-ante loser in the sense that almost invariably these are titles that can't get a publisher. Now, here's one of my favorite teaser fact pictures. This is from the chapter about books and from a paper about books. This is looking at, over time, what share of the books on the USA Today bestseller list, which is the top 150 titles by week in the US. And it asks, of those titles, what share of them were originally released as self-published titles? They might later have been picked up, but the point is, their original mode of release tells us whether they ever would have made it to market. And what's amazing is that, you know, in the period after Kindle, in the Kindle era, we see that the overall share rises to about 10%. In the romance category, it rises to, you know, basically 50%. That is just shocking, right? If you're a New York publisher, the traditional gatekeeper deciding, and now decisions that are being made, you know, independent of you are accounting for a big fraction of eventual success. This is a very, very different world. And by the way, it's not just 50 Shades of Grey, although 50 Shades of Grey is a big example of this. It was originally self-published and it's sold quite a lot. But it's not just that. There are many, many titles in this story. I do want to talk a little bit about it's sort of a geek economic question, but I think it's actually a bigger deal than that, which is how big a deal has digitization been for the welfare of consumers and producers for that matter? And really, this is a little bit of a side trip into the long tail and a new way to think about the long tail that this work implies. So first, this picture, what am I saying? The standard view of digitization, prior to the story that I'm telling, is that digitization gives consumers access to an infinite shelf space. So instead of like the 100,000 titles in your local bookstore or record store, you have access to 1 million titles online. So it gives you access to the other 900,000 titles. Now, if you think about that, and that is a good story, and I believe it, but I think it's incomplete. That would say, you know, in this picture, we have like the number of products along the horizontal axis and some measure of well-being, whether it's revenue or consumer surplus along the vertical axis. If you have access to the 100,000 most valuable products, that gets you most of the way to everything available to you. Giving you access to the other 900,000, well, that gets you from these made-up numbers, 77 up to 100-ish in this slide. You know, it's a big deal, but it's not a huge deal. And this is the standard long tail argument. Again, I think it's a good argument and it's true, but it's incomplete. And why is it incomplete? Well, because digitization doesn't just give you access to the worst, the bottom tail of the extant products. It allows a whole bunch of new products to be created. So think about this as an increase in by a factor of 10. That's again made up to illustrate in the number of new products created. If we could perfectly predict how good things would be before we did it, then adding by a factor of 10 would just add us the low value products from the previous picture. If we have no ability to predict whatsoever, then as we add products, we'd be on this dashed line. We would actually increase enormously the value of the choice set to people because we'd add products that were on average as valuable as the products we already had. So that'd be the nobody knows anything perspective. So with unpredictability, this is like adding new products is like taking draws from an urn. If, you know, literally nobody knows anything, then benefits grow linearly in the number of products, almost linearly anyways. What's the benefit of tripling the number of new products? Well, the standard answer is A. That's the traditional long tail. My answer, and this is in work with Luis Aguiar, my answer is B. And B is, you know, B is bigger than A, but how big is it? Now, so far, this is all speculation until we do something empirical with it. And so I have this paper published in 2018 where we look at music in particular. So what happened in music, there was a tripling in the number of new products entering per year between about 2000 and 2010. And the question is, which third of the products introduced in each year would have existed without digitization? Again, in a world of perfect predictability, all the valuable ones. But in a world of no predictability, a random third. The question is, which world do we live in? Well, it's not all the way to random world. So what we did to assess that was to look at the products released and try to predict how successful they would turn out to be based on stuff known at the time of release. And we could explain about a third of it. It's a pure prediction exercise, about a third. And under the 1/3 answer, the B over A, the amount by which this random long tail exceeds the traditional long tail, is about 20. And so our view, now we could quibble about whether it's 18 or 22 or even 10. But the point is, if A is big, and we all agree the long tail is a big deal, then B is enormous because it's 20 times A, or if you like, it's 10 times A or something. So I feel like that this digitization has had a very big effect on welfare, operating precisely because we don't know which of these products is going to be big. And if we can just get a lot more products tried, then we can find a bunch more valuable products. Okay, so taking a little bit of stock. So before I move to the kind of the other part, the other last part of the talk, you know, where we started, there was collapsing revenue in music And there was, a threat to intermediaries in all these industries, a threat to nurture, a threat to adult supervision, and the need for more IP protection, the belief. But what happened was cost reduction and just a host of new products. And moreover, because of this unpredictability business, a lot of the new products are appealing. Now, again, most of the new products are not. There is an open slush pile. But what matters to consumers and to welfare is, are there some good products that end up appealing to a lot of folks? And the answer seems to be yes. And moreover, the new vintages appear to be good compared to the old. So we arguably are living in a golden age. I've shown you evidence in music. I would argue there's strong evidence in these other categories as well. And I'd argue we're experiencing a digital renaissance. Okay. So Act 3, though. Now, there is a challenge, though. We have this big haystack, if you will, of products, and we want to find the needles of good ones. And so product discovery is not a trivial issue. In fact, over the years, as I've talked about this research, people would often ask me, well, wait a minute, how do those welfare benefits even come about? I mean, okay, you showed me they exist, but I don't really believe it because I don't see how they could come about. And I think this is a fruitful area for more research, and I've been focusing on it for the past couple of years. So I want to talk a little bit about some studies and talk a little bit about the roles of Amazon and Spotify in product discovery in books and music. And then I also talk a little bit, if there's time, about the possible abuse of platform power, because I think we're all concerned about platforms and their possible abuse of power. So we'll get there. So let's talk first about books. And this is based on some work I published, actually just came out this year, the Imca Reimers and the AER on, and the big question is, how has digitization affected the welfare benefits from pre-purchase information? So that's a lot of words just to say, look, we used to learn about books before we bought them from reviewers. And now we have reviewers, but we also have things like Amazon stars. And what's kind of interesting, just to sort of set the stage, is, well, there's a limited number of books reviewed, even by a huge outlet like the New York Times, which is by far the biggest in the US. But every book, virtually every book, has Amazon star ratings. So the question is, do those respective things have an influence on purchase, and do they have an influence on what people know, and therefore the benefit that consumers can derive from products? So how has digitization changed pre-purchase information and the consumer welfare derived from these markets? So just to say a little bit of this slowly, the professional review landscape in the US, I mean, there are lots of outlets, but the New York Times is by far the biggest, both in reach and in number of products covered. There are also a few reviews in some of these other newspapers. So in this paper, we mostly look at the Times, but we also collect some other regional newspapers. Then on the crowd side, as opposed to the professionals, we have star ratings at Amazon. And essentially every book has star ratings, and actually there are quite a large number of star ratings. So for each book. So I want to talk a little bit about the theory of how pre-purchase information affects welfare. This is not original theory to us, but it's kind of a new approach that people have been using to think about this distinction sometimes between the ex ante and ex post utility. Because I mean, remember, we buy stuff based on what we believe, but then we experience it and maybe we're disappointed or we're happily surprised. So in this story, consumers make purchase decisions based on their pre-purchase expectations of quality. Now, let's suppose they know the truth in advance when pre-purchase information is available. And I'm putting that in quotes just to say we're overstating how simple this is. Now, but if they don't have pre-purchase information available, they make some guess. So they don't have reviews or ratings. Now, the idea is that the benefit of pre-purchase information is to bring purchase behavior in line with what they would have learned ex post. At the time they're deciding whether to buy, they now know what they would have learned after the fact, consuming it themselves. So the way this story works is like, here's the world where you know everything before you buy. And so this is the aggregate demand for some particular book. People collectively consume Q star units, and the both anticipated and realized consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. This is sort of a textbook, undergrad textbook world. But what if consumers are not well informed? So let's suppose that they expect it to be worse than what's true. Then they collectively have this dashed demand curve, and what they do is they consume Q1 instead of Q star. This is a better book than they thought. They should have consumed Q star, but they consumed Q1. Now, if they consume Q1, they don't get A as consumer surplus because they get it, and it turns out to be better than they thought, so they get A plus B. They expected A, but they get A plus B. Now, if they had pre-purchase information, they would have consumed out to Q star. They would have gotten A plus B plus C. So here, the benefit of being informed prior to purchase is to get C. And there's an analogous benefit of being told something's worse than you thought, which would be D. So the idea of this ex ante ex post business is to get people to know in advance what they would have known after the fact. And you pick up these triangles if you know in advance stuff you only would have known after the fact before. So what we do in the paper, we look at 10,000 titles in the US in 2018. It's a pretty representative sample. We have both popular and unpopular. We have all the stuff reviewed by the Times, but we have the USA Today bestsellers, then a whole bunch of sort of long tail books. We observe daily sales ranks. That's kind of cool. It's generally hard to get quantity data, but you can get daily sales ranks from Amazon and daily prices and star ratings. We also get the timing of the New York Times and other newspaper reviews. We have this for 3 Amazon domains, US, Canada, Great Britain. And it's worth noting, that not only does New York Times review sort of a small subset, but it's also a subset that's skewed toward particular kinds of topics. It's not juvenile fiction, it's not romance, it's sort of serious stuff. Okay, so I won't put a lot of notation or stuff here, but here are just some pictures of the Times effects in the other newspapers. Pretty clearly, they have an immediate and substantial effect on sales. These pictures are sort of pretty in that respect. These are daily effects. There's no effect before the review, and then there's an effect afterwards, and then it decays. Other newspapers, it's smaller, not surprisingly, because those are much smaller reach. Now, the Amazon star side, a little more complicated. There isn't quite the same pretty picture. But here what we can do is we can leverage the fact that we observe daily data, and we observe the star ratings daily, and they change every so often. We observe prices and all that sort of stuff. So what we can do is we can estimate a model in which we have title-specific fixed effects, or even title by platform fixed effects, and do something like what Judy Chevalier and Dina Maslin did in their celebrated in 2006 paper, but with a lot more data. And we end up with estimates of the impact of star ratings and reviews that are comparable. We have to so what can you say? Star ratings matter, more so as there are more people rating them. Professional reviews matter. You already saw that in pictures. If we can say, what's the aggregate impact of a book being reviewed by the New York Times versus a book having a star rating over the course of the year? The answer, by the way, it ends up being that a Times review is about twice as effective, or has twice as much impact as a star rating. But here's the key: every book gets star ratings, and only a few books get New York Times reviews. So you can guess where this is going to go. Now, we do some sort of fancy stuff in the paper where we take these causal estimates and translate them into a little structural model, a welfare model. But the punchline is going to be, when we translate this into a nested logit model and derive the consumer surplus, the aggregate change in CS, consumer surplus, from star ratings is about 10 times bigger than the aggregate effect of the traditional, professional elite reviewers. And that's even though the star ratings are only operating on half the market, the half that is Amazon. So in some sense, information has the capacity, digital style information has the capacity to have an even bigger welfare effect. I hate where this sentence is going. If only Amazon had a bigger market share. Okay, so what you could say is that digitization brings both the cost, explosion in the number of products, and also an aspect of the solution to the product discovery problem, because I think crowd ratings that are made available, collected and distributed digitally seem like a pretty digital phenomenon. Meanwhile, over in the recorded music business, this theme of digitization facilitating an explosion couldn't be more true. I mean, 5 million, how many songs did Spotify add in 2018? 5 million songs. That's a lot of products. And that's a lot of products for, a real challenge to the product discovery problem. I should also, just in thinking about music, the old days, we had really fragmented markets. So there were thousands of radio stations, independent of one another, deciding what to play and promote. Thousands of record stores, independent of one another, deciding what to promote. I mean, it's quaint to think people used to get up, bent out of shape about Walmart because it had whatever, 10% of the record market. But, think of the power they have. Well, now, essentially, we have 2 players, Spotify and Apple Music. I know in Europe, I think we have Deezer as well, but we essentially have 2 gatekeepers that are doing everything. They're both playing the role of the record player, record store, and the radio station. So this is like, if you were scared before, you're really scared now. There's a lot of concentration of potential power here. And so the question that this paper, that I want to ask here is, well, the main way in which music is being promoted now, or one of the main ways, is via these playlists at Spotify. And so the question is, do these playlists have impacts on what gets discovered, what gets listened to, because if so, then we're going to think a little bit about whether this power is abused. So what are playlists? Well, they're informative lists of songs, but they're also utilities for playing music. They're editorial content, so they say no, payola is not allowed, and certainly Spotify doesn't take payola. Now, anybody can start a playlist, and there are some famous examples of third parties starting playlists that are sort of notorious, but the truth is Spotify dominates the playlist because they dominate the real estate. So do they have the ability to influence users' list decisions? Okay, so let me cut to the chase here. So what we do is we look at a bunch of the biggest playlists. We look at the events in which songs are added to and subtracted from these lists. And the biggest lists, like today's top hits, had 20 million followers at the time of the study. And I think a picture is better than a bunch of words. Here's a picture. If you look at the date on which a song is added to today's top hits and the date on which it's subtracted or dropped, you see these pretty big jumps in streams. And you see this for the other major lists as well. It's pretty clear that there's a causal impact of being added to the list to the amount of streams. And indeed, it's pretty valuable. Being added to today's top hits is worth about $77,000 in the value of the streaming payments. And moreover, the share of the total streams that these songs get that's induced by the add to these playlists is on the order of about a quarter of those streams. So there really is some power to influence what happens through these platforms. There are similar effects with new music. The new music lists are a little bit more challenging to study. Those are the lists that have 50 new songs each week. But our assessment is that about half of the relationship. So on those lists, a song gets ranked from first to 50th. If you get ranked first, you stream a lot. Now, part of that is just the predictive effect of sort of songs predicted to be better get ranked higher, but part of it is a causal impact, and we could talk for an hour about how it is that we derive that. But we think it's about half of that is the causal impact. So, I mean, bottom line, and in some sense this shouldn't be surprising, Spotify has a lot of power to determine which songs and which artists succeed. I think that's a fair statement. So let me talk just for a minute about bias, since after all, the fam and everything's on everyone's minds. So these new music lists, we can think a little bit about whether power is exercised with bias. And there are two forms of bias that people have been talking about in the music industry, maybe more. But one is about independent record labels versus major record labels. And there's also talk about bias against women. There's certainly a lot of Me Too discussion as well. There should be in the music industry. Now, demonstrating bias is really hard. So we have to have some clever strategy for doing it. And I think we do. So here's what we do. It's an outcome-based approach, we call it. We're going to compare the ex-post performance of independent and major label songs that are assessed to have equal promise by these curators. What does that mean? Well, the curators give them the same new music rank. Well, do they stream the same amount after the fact? It's bias if they don't. And I'll say that again in a minute, so I hope it's clear. So ex ante, at the time the song is released, the curators decide to put it on the list and decide the order in which to put it. Should I put it number 1 on the list, number 5, number 10, number 20? What should I do? And the big idea is that if indie songs outperform major songs that are assessed to have the same ex ante rank, then the ranking would be biased against indies. That's the idea. So how do we think about this? Curators, we think about songs as differing in what we call likability. And more likable songs are ones where, once you listen to it, you'd be more likely to listen to it again. Now, better ranks on the new music list give more exposure. So a stream maximizing curator would put the most likable songs at the top of the list and the less likable songs down lower, because why waste the high exposure of a good rank on a song that people wouldn't like much? That's how you might think about it. What's bias? Well, bias is deviating from this method of ranking. So putting songs differentially likable by indies versus major at the same rank. So if this is true, then what should we see? Well, do curators, sorry to overload you here for a second, but do curators rank according to likability? Well, we have two kinds of evidence of this. One is just the ex-post streams on the left-hand side. Higher ranked songs stream more. Now, just 3 minutes ago, I told you half of that was causal, but half of it's not causal. It's purely they're putting the more likable songs higher on the list. If you're not sure about that evidence, You can also think about the past streams of the artists whose songs are currently on the list. Past streams are highly predictive of future streams because popular stuff is popular. And it turns out that the songs that get higher ranked are songs by artists who have been more popular in the past. So it really does look like, to a first approximation, broadly, curators are trying to rank to maximize streams. Well, where does bias come in? Well, bias comes in if, I'll say what's on the slide, you do songs with the same curator assessment, meaning the same new music rank, ultimately experience the same success. And so do indie songs end up streaming less than major songs conditional on new music ranks? And again, a picture is worth probably 1,000 words. So let me go to a picture. What does this show? Left-hand side picture shows the share of the songs that are assigned each rank that ultimately stream in the top 200 on Spotify. The dark is indie, the lighter is major. What this shows you is that indie songs stream less conditional on rank than major songs. Same thing's true in the right-hand side panel, it's just the log of streams instead of streams. What does that say? Well, conditional on New Music Friday rank, indie songs have less streaming success. How about by gender? Well, here it's pretty similar for the top 10, but for the next 10, it's a little different. Conditional on New Music Friday rank, female songs or songs by women have less streaming success, songs in the 11 through 20 range of that rank. So what does that mean? This is consistent with curators being biased in favor of indie and to a lesser extent in favor of songs by women. Okay, so some speculation on these results, and I'm going to take this in for a landing very shortly. So, I mean, we were puzzled and a little bit surprised. Maybe Spotify is responsive to the criticism they are getting from the industry. There are a lot of industry criticism about gender. Maybe promoting indie music is going to make life better for them in the future, negotiating with record labels if they deconcentrate the market they're buying from. But, in case you don't care about music and care about platforms, we think this approach is applicable elsewhere, because all you need is an ex-ante assessment and then some ex-post success measure. And that's pretty generically true in like retail platforms that rank order results. And then in principle, you can measure, which things people click through and buy. So this ought to be applicable to other contexts if you just had the data. Okay, so where has digitization left us? Well, I think the answer is what I would say is for cultural worrywart. There's lots of evidence of good new products, even if there is an open slush fund. So lighten up. That would be my suggestion to the worrywarts. For copyright policymakers, I think that we should take industry claims, the sky is falling, with a grain of salt, because the industry and the products aren't quite the same thing. I think it's also really important to ask the right question. What's happening to the quality and quantity of new products? And then answer it with evidence. Bring evidence-based policymaking to copyright. So it seems obvious, but I think these things aren't really done yet. For consumers, I guess, sit back, relax, and enjoy. And then I'd say, despite the deluge, there's some reason for optimism that digitization also brings the processes that help discovery. But notwithstanding the good news about platforms today, I think we should keep an eye on them, make sure they stay in our interest. Okay, thank you so much. There's fair use, I hope. Okay.
All right, I'm not sure if it's back to me.
Yeah, no, this is the funny thing. I can't see anything, so I don't know. Just us, right?
I think it might be. I'm just waiting to the live video flicks over. Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Joel. That was really great. You never fail to impress me with the volume of data you collect and the depth of your analysis. I'm amazed at the depth of the analysis, the findings, the implications, and how you can tie it all together with the production side of things, the distribution, the consumers, and we have some questions. So I'm going to actually read from the first one through to the last one. I've got one from Carol Jan Barowecki, and he asks, in relation to the question on whether the new music is good, I wonder of what quality will be in the near future music created by AI. Will it be good enough to compete with old new music created by human musicians? You might have heard the Nirvana song that they did recently, with an AI that wasn't so good, but who knows in the future? I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
Gosh, I mean, it's hard to speculate. It's funny. So I'll just offer two oblique comments. One is people keep telling me that, no, there are technologies for predicting what's going to succeed. And that doesn't seem to work yet. And so if you can't do that, you probably can't make music. But who knows? Maybe I've seen the science fiction movies too. I mean, one of the fascinating things is if we could either produce music that would succeed, or even just predict which things could succeed, that would be enormously valuable because we wouldn't waste all that effort producing bad stuff. So I think, I don't really know whether it is feasible, but if it were feasible, the benefits of doing it would be rather enormous. And so it's something to keep our eye on. And, if you have evidence that an AI can make music that people like, that would have huge welfare benefits.
In the there was a panel discussion just before us, and I just caught a bit of it, but there was a paper on machine learning and predicting art prices. So who knows where machine learning is going to take us as well. I've read a lot of it in relation to predicting box office outcomes. I'm sure you've seen it as well. The next question from Paul Crosby. How do you think the golden age of music will hold up with the rise of songs written specifically with short form video platforms like TikTok in mind? It seems like writing a catchy 15-second that may go viral is now a key record company strategy, and the well-crafted song with a sweeping chorus may be on the way out.
So, I share that concern. I think I'm of a generation that shares that concern, just not non-scientifically. But here's what I think, though. There is such a range of feasible production that it is true. Maybe these serious players are devoting a lot of effort to what seems very ephemeral, and maybe they are. But there is so much else being created that I guess what I would hope for and maybe expect is that the value of the entire vintage is good. So, but I do share the concern that maybe some of the high investment stuff is built precisely to be ephemeral and not to be durable. I don't know.
Great. Question from Alan Collins. Thinking about digitization, are we conflating product discovery and rediscovery by different generations appearing as new? More generally, are there different welfare implications due to extent of archive as opposed to the offer of genuinely new material?
Well, so no, this is a great point. I mean, so what's so interesting is as any Spotify user knows, all of a sudden you have access to everything, everything you can ever remember, and even things you don't remember, you can discover. I mean, in some sense, what's interesting is that the new vintages seem to be highly used, conditional on age, in an environment in which people have additional access to the old vintages. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to learn that there's a whole bunch of new discovery of old vintages. But at the same time, the access to old vintages isn't undermining the interest, the apparent interest I showed in those usage indices in the new stuff. So I think there's an interesting set of issues in the question, but I don't think it explains what I'm claiming. But I think there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff to study there.
Thank you. Hendrik Sonnerband asks, since paying the artist is another issue in the digital age, he'd like to hear your opinion on alternative payment systems related to music streaming, like the pay who you play, the user-centric payment system.
Yeah, that was super interesting. So it turns out Victor Ginsburg has this really cool paper about the museum pass game that says the Shapley value in the context of bundled goods is essentially to pay people, the user-centric approach, right? So if I only listen to one artist, my $10 minus the administration fee should go to that one artist, and that's not how it works. But it is super interesting that's sort of under discussion. I mean, so I agree with that. I don't know whether I'm not even sure on balance who wins from that, but I think there's theoretical reasons to think that that's a better way to do it. Now, having said all that, there is a lot of discussion about whether artists are earning enough money, whether songwriters or performers. And I without wanting to be callous, I mean, there is, on the one hand, we do hear a lot of concerns about inadequate earnings. On the other hand, we see an explosion of production. Like if farmers said, "Oh, we're not earning enough, that's why we're producing more stuff," we would laugh at them. So I don't laugh at artists, but I think there are a lot of things going on. A whole bunch of the new production is by artists who are not full-time artists. And so their average earnings are not an indicator of their whether they can survive. Now, again, there are plenty of artists with legitimate concerns, but I think what's just standing way back, this is an industry that's that's creating more and more and more products. And so it doesn't look like an industry that's straining to have adequate revenue to generate new stuff.
Great. We're getting close to time, but we might try and squeeze another couple of questions in. Sunny Shin asks, how would all of the machine learning based product recommendation algorithms, which are getting better day by day, fit your discussion? Would they have new implications for product discovery and consumer surplus?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a great area of thinking about this. So like what we're doing is the most primitive thing, that Amazon thing, there's just a star, and it's the same star rating for everyone, so it's not even machine learning. The only machine learning in there is throwing out the fraudulent ones. Imagine a world in which you get a personalized recommendation and it's actually accurate. Then the welfare benefits would be even bigger. So I think there, in some sense, it's the tip of the iceberg to talk about like star ratings as opposed to personalized collaborative filter style recommendations. I suspect that the digital benefits are much bigger along the lines of your question, precisely because there's personalization, with lots of data on folks who have tastes like yours.
Thank you. And I think we have, I'm not sure this is a question, this is probably more of a statement, a comment that I think we all agree with, from Heritiana, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Heritiana Renovoisen. She states that the last statement that you made was, even more important, platforms need to be held accountable under scrutiny from the regulators and the scholars and the citizens. So obviously, that's a big
No, I
topic.
still agree with you. I mean, I still agree with that. And I mean, so one kind word about Spotify is that at least they make some data available. A lot of these platforms are really opaque, and I anybody who can get data out of them, I applaud you.
Great. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much, Joel. I'm sure everybody enjoyed it. I certainly did.
If ever I get to meet you folks in person, say hello to me, please.
All right. Well, we'll sign off there. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.